A long, long time ago, not so far from now in history, a new kind of magic swept across the lands. It wasn't the kind of magic with wands and spells, but a magic of gears, steam, and clever machines. People were excited. They found new ways to build things, especially houses. Before this time, folks built their homes with things they found right around them. Big, heavy stones, soft, rich earth, bundles of hay, and sturdy tree trunks. These were the old ways, passed down from grandmas and grandpas. But when a new magic came, many people started to think these old ways were, well, not so good. They looked at a house made of rough stones or mud and thought, that's old-fashioned. That's for simple folk. They saw the new factories churning out smooth, thin boards and shiny metal, and they believed this was the future. This was progress. Why would anyone bother to stack heavy rocks or mix mud and straw when they could quickly put together a house with these new, lighter materials? Imagine a village where for hundreds of years, every house was a cozy, thick-walled haven. The stone homes stood like sleepy giants, their walls so wide you could almost nap on the windowsills. The earth houses, sometimes called sod houses or adobe homes, looked like they grew right out of the ground, blending with the hills. They felt solid and safe, like a warm hug on a cold day. People knew these houses. They knew how to fix them, how to keep them warm in winter and cool in summer. The knowledge was in their fingers, in their memories, passed down like treasured lullabies. Then, busy people with new ideas came to the village. They carried blueprints and talked about efficiency and modernity. They showed off drawings of houses that looked sharp and neat, built with slim wood frames and thin walls. See, they'd say, pointing to the pictures, these houses go up so fast. No more back-breaking work, lifting giant stones. No more waiting for mud to dry. We can build a whole street of these homes in the time it takes to build one of your old-fashioned cabins. And many villagers listened. They were tired of the hard work. They were curious about the new and shiny things. It seemed like a wonderful dream. Houses built faster, with less sweat, and looking so neat and tidy. They started to believe that anything made with a machine, anything new, had to be better. They began to look at their old, sturdy stone and earth houses with a new eye, an eye that saw them as primitive or inferior. The word primitive sounds a bit like old-fashioned, but also means not as good, like something from time long, long ago when people didn't know as much. They thought of these natural materials, the rough stones from the river, the dark earth from the fields, the dry hay from the harvest, the raw timber from the forest, as just, well, plain. They were everywhere, easy to find, and didn't cost much money. But because they were so common, and because they didn't come from a noisy, smoking factory, people started to think they weren't valuable. They were seen as things for people who couldn't afford the better stuff, the factory-made stuff. A shift happened, like the turning of a big, slow wheel. Children who once helped their parents gather stones for a new wall or mix mud for repairs now watched trains carrying stacks of factory-cut lumber. They learned how to hammer thin nails into thin boards, a much quicker job than fitting heavy stones together with care. The old skills, the deep understanding of how earth could keep a house warm or how a thick stone wall could block the fiercest wind, slowly began to fade, like an old photograph left in the sun. It wasn't that people stopped wanting good homes. They still wanted to be safe and warm. But they were convinced that the new way was the best way. They believed that the march of progress meant leaving behind the heavy, natural materials for lighter, factory-made ones. They didn't yet understand that sometimes the simplest things hold the greatest strength, especially when facing the might of nature. They were about to learn a lesson, not from books or factories, but from the cold wind and the stubborn earth itself. The shiny new ways of building spread like wildfire, convincing many that the old methods were clumsy and slow. People eagerly put up their new, thinner-walled homes, proud of how quickly they stood. Yet, as years turned into decades, a curious thing started to happen. While some of these newer houses, built with their slim wood frames and lighter boards, began to creak, sag, and even fall apart, the older homes stood firm. Imagine the wind howling, strong enough to shake the leaves from trees and make new houses shiver. But the old stone cabins, with walls as thick as a bear's hug, just seemed to lean into the storm, unbothered. The earth houses, snuggled into the land, simply became part of the strong earth itself. They didn't shake. They didn't complain. They just were. There was a little village named Oakhaven, nestled in a valley where the winters bit hard and the summers were fierce. For generations, the families of Oakhaven lived in houses built of big, rough stones gathered from the nearby river and thick, packed earth from the fields. These homes looked like they had always been there, sturdy and strong, their roofs heavy with sod that grew green in spring. When the new building ideas came, some people in Oakhaven decided to try them. Why lift heavy stones? They asked. Why spend weeks packing earth when we can build a house in days with these light, new boards? So they built houses that looked different, with thinner walls and taller, straighter lines. They were proud of their modern homes. At first, everything seemed fine. The new houses went up fast, and they looked bright and new. But then came the seasons. A really bad storm hit Oakhaven one autumn. The wind roared like a hungry beast, tearing at everything in its path. Tree branches snapped, and fences blew away. In the morning, when the storm finally quieted, people looked around at the damage. Many of the newer, lighter houses had suffered. Some had lost parts of their roofs. Others had windows smashed in, or their thin walls had cracked and warped. Families huddled together, shivering in their damaged homes, wondering how they would fix everything. But the old houses, they stood almost untouched. The stone walls, so thick and heavy, had laughed at the wind. The packed earth homes, solid as mountains, hadn't even swayed. Their roofs, made of heavy timber and thick layers of dirt and grass, held fast against the gales. Inside these old homes, families had slept soundly, barely noticing the storm's fury. The warmth they had built up during the day was still trapped within those strong walls. Old man Silas, whose house was a round, cozy earth home, sat on his porch, sipping hot tea. He watched his neighbors trying to put boards back on their new houses. His own home had faced countless storms over more than 100 years, and it was still as good as new. They called my house primitive, he mumbled, a small smile playing on his lips. But it's still here, warm and dry. It wasn't just storms. Over time, the materials in the newer houses started to wear out faster. The thin wood could rot if it got too wet, or warp if it got too dry. The metal parts could rust, but the stone and earth, if built right, seemed to get stronger with age, like a good wine. The sun baked the earth walls harder, making them even tougher. The stones settled more deeply into their places, becoming one with the mortar. People started to notice. They saw their grandparents' old stone cabin, built generations ago, still standing tall and strong, perhaps with a few mossy patches that only made it look more wise. Meanwhile, a house built just 20 years ago, with all the modern materials, might already need major repairs or even be falling down. It was a slow realization, like watching a flower open petal by petal. At first, the new seemed better because it was new and quick, but over many years, the old showed its true strength. The thick walls of stone and earth weren't just old-fashioned. They were champions of endurance. They had a kind of quiet power that the lighter, factory-made materials simply couldn't match. Children growing up in Oakhaven, who had once been told the old houses were not as good, now saw with their own eyes the difference. They saw the solidness, the unwavering strength of the old structures. They played hide-and-seek among the ancient stone walls, feeling the cool, smooth surface against their hands, a stark contrast to the rattling, creaking sounds of some of the newer, flimsier homes. This observation wasn't just happening in Oakhaven. In villages and towns far and wide, where both old and new buildings stood side by side, the pattern was the same. The historical cabins, built with the wisdom of the earth and the strength of stone, simply outlasted their younger, more advanced neighbors. They stood as silent teachers, proving that sometimes the simplest methods, using the materials given by nature, were the most enduring. It was a lesson in humility, showing that what was once dismissed as inferior often held a secret strength. The strength of the old homes was a marvel to behold, especially after a harsh storm. but their true magic shone brightest when the bitter cold swept through the land. Imagine a place where winter bites with icy teeth, where the wind howls like a hungry wolf, carrying snowflakes that sting like tiny needles. In such a place, a warm home isn't just nice, it's a matter of life and death. Let's think about the village of Oakhaven again, where the stone and earth houses stood tall even after the wildest winds. When winter truly arrived, it brought with it days that felt like endless nights, and nights that seemed to stretch into forever. The sun, when it peeked out, offered little warmth. The air itself felt heavy and cold, ready to steal the heat from anything it touched. In the newer houses, with their thin wooden walls, people often shivered. No matter how much they burned in their fireplaces, the heat seemed to escape through every crack and every thin board. The wind would whistle right through the walls, making curtains dance and sending chills down spines. Children would huddle under many blankets, their breath making little clouds in the cold air of their bedrooms. They might even see frost forming on the inside of their window panes, a frosty artwork made by the cold trying to get in. Keeping warm was a constant fight, a battle against the sneaky, cold air. But step inside one of the old stone cabins or a cozy earth home, and it was a different world. These houses were like giant, warm cocoons. Their walls, remember, were very, very thick, sometimes as wide as a grown-up's arm stretched out. This thickness was like a superpower. It didn't let the cold air sneak in, and it didn't let the warm air sneak out. Imagine the sun shining on a cold winter morning. The thick stone walls would slowly soak up that tiny bit of warmth like a sponge soaking up water. Then, when the sun went down and the air grew even colder, those walls would slowly let go of the warmth they had saved, gently heating the rooms inside. It was like the house itself was breathing, holding warmth in its heart and sharing it when it was most needed. The packed earth houses were even better at this trick. Earth is a wonderful friend to warmth. It holds heat for a long, long time. So a fire built in the morning would warm the earth walls, and those walls would keep the house toasty warm all through the night, sometimes even into the next day, without needing more wood. People inside would wear fewer layers, their fingers and toes staying warm, their faces rosy from the gentle heat that filled the air. And the wind? Oh, the wind was no match for these ancient guardians. The thick, heavy walls of stone and earth were like an unbreakable shield. The wind could howl and roar outside, but inside you would barely hear it. There were no tiny cracks for the cold gusts to squeeze through. The solidness of the materials meant that the house was truly sealed against the elements. It felt safe, protected, like being inside a warm, quiet cave while a storm raged outside. Families in these older homes knew a comfort that their neighbors in the newer houses could only dream of. They used less firewood, saving their precious resources. They spent less time shivering and more time telling stories, playing games, or simply resting, truly warm. Grandparents would sit by the hearth, not just for the direct heat of the fire, but because the whole house was wrapped in a blanket of warmth held by its sturdy walls. Children who lived in these old homes remembered the feeling of warmth that seemed to come from the very bones of the house. They would lean against a stone wall that felt cool in summer but pleasantly mild in winter, a constant, steady warmth that never felt harsh or fleeting. They knew that when the snow piled high outside and the wind whistled a lonely tune, their home would always be a snug, safe harbor. It was a powerful lesson. People had been so eager for speed and newness, for houses that looked crisp and modern. But when it came to the most basic need, staying warm and safe from the biting cold, the primitive ways proved to be far superior. The thick stone walls and tightly packed earth weren't just strong, they were clever. They understood how to work with nature, trapping the precious heat and bravely pushing back against the icy wind. It was a warmth born of wisdom, not just wood, and it kept generations alive and comfortable through the harshest of winters. The proof was undeniable. The storms had battered, and the winters had bitten, yet the old houses stood strong and warm. Slowly, like the first rays of morning sun peeking over a hill, a big secret began to reveal itself to the people. It wasn't written in books or shouted from rooftops, but whispered by the wind and felt in the steady warmth of a home. People living in these old houses, and even those who had moved into newer ones but observed closely, started to learn something very important. Sometimes simple things, heavy materials, and gifts from nature could be much, much better than all the clever new machines and their shiny products. Think about little Alara, a girl who lived in Oakhaven. Her grandma, Nana May, lived in one of the oldest earth houses in the village, a round, cozy place with thick walls. Alara's own family lived in a newer wooden house, built quickly with factory-made planks. In winter, Alara often felt cold, even when a fire crackled in their small stove. The wind seemed to find its way through every tiny crack, making her shiver under her blankets. But when she visited Nana May's house, it was like stepping into a different season. The air inside was always soft and warm, even if the fire in the hearth had gone out hours ago. Alara would lean against the thick earth wall, feeling a gentle, steady warmth that seemed to come from deep within the house itself. Nana May didn't need to burn as much wood as Alara's family did, and her house stayed comfortable all day and all night. Nana, Alara once asked, "Why is your house so much warmer than ours, even when we have a bigger fire?" Nana May smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She patted the thick wall beside them. "This, my dear, is the secret. Your house is like a thin coat. It keeps some warmth, but the wind can still sneak in. My house is like a big, thick winter blanket. It holds the warmth tight and doesn't let the wind through." She explained how the heavy earth walls, built layer by layer, soaked up the sun's warmth during the day and the fire's heat at night. Then, slowly, kindly, they would give that warmth back to the rooms like a loving hug that lasted for hours. The sheer mass, how heavy and thick the materials were, was the key. It wasn't about being fancy or new. It was about being solid and substantial. This was the mass part of the secret. The heavy stone and packed earth had a special power to store heat. Lighter, thinner materials, even if they looked modern and were quick to build with, just couldn't do that. They let heat slip away too easily, like water through a sieve. And the natural materials part? Well, the stones were pulled from the river, the earth dug from the ground, the hay gathered from the fields, and the timber cut from the forest. These things were not changed much by machines. They were used as they were in their simple, powerful form. They were free, or almost free, and they worked in harmony with the land. They breathed with the seasons, strong against the elements. Alara started to notice other things. When a big storm came, her family's house would creak and groan, sometimes even shake a little. But Nana May's house stood firm, a quiet haven. The thick walls blocked out the noise of the wind and rain, making the inside feel peaceful and safe. It wasn't just about warmth. It was about protection, about lasting through anything. This realization wasn't just for children like Alara. Grown-ups, too, began to talk about it. Farmers who had built new sheds that blew over in a strong gust looked at the old stone barns that had stood for 100 years and more. They saw that the old ways, though they took more time and effort to build at first, ended up saving more time, money, and worry in the long run. The simplicity of it all was also part of the secret. Building with natural materials didn't need complicated machines or fancy parts that could break. It needed strong hands, a good eye, and an understanding of how nature worked. A stone was a stone, earth was earth. They didn't have many moving parts or tiny pieces that could go wrong. This made them reliable, trustworthy. So, the big secret was this. The grand ideas of new machines and speedy building had made people forget something very old and very true. The earth, the stone, the timber, and the hay, these simple, heavy, natural materials, had an enduring strength and warmth that the latest technology couldn't beat. They were not inferior. They were superior in the most important ways, keeping people safe, warm, and dry when survival depended on it. It was a quiet wisdom, rediscovered through the harsh lessons of winter and the stubborn resilience of the old homes. The villagers of Oakhaven, and others like them, began to look at their surroundings with new eyes, seeing the power in the plain, natural world once more. The lessons of the old houses, whispered by the wind and felt in their enduring warmth, slowly changed minds. People began to truly understand the deep wisdom held within those thick walls. They realized that in the grand scheme of life, especially when faced with nature's fierce moods, staying warm wasn't just about comfort. It was about survival itself. It was the difference between health and sickness, between life and death, especially in places where winter was a long, cold battle. Imagine a time before easy doctors or plentiful medicines, when a bad chill could quickly turn into something much worse. If a family couldn't keep warm through the long, dark nights of winter, their chances of staying healthy were slim. Babies and old folks were especially at risk. A home that could reliably hold warmth was a lifeline, a guardian against the dangers of the cold. The old stone cabins and packed earth homes were more than just buildings. They were fortresses of life. They stood strong and silent, protecting generations from the harsh outside world. Take the story of the Miller family, who lived in a small, ancient stone house near the Whispering Woods. Their house had been built by their great-great-grandparents, who knew the land and its cold secrets. One winter, a terrible blizzard swept through the region, unlike any seen in many years. Snow fell for days, piling up higher than the windows of most houses. The wind shrieked, making even the sturdiest trees bend and groan. Roads were blocked, and no one could leave their homes. It was a time of fear and worry for many. In the newer, thinner wooden houses, families huddled together, wrapping themselves in every blanket they owned. Their fireplaces roared, consuming wood at an alarming rate, but the heat seemed to vanish almost as quickly as it was made. They worried about running out of firewood, about the cold seeping into their bones, about sickness. Their children cried from the chill, and their elders coughed with worry. But in the Miller stone house, things were different. Yes, it was a severe storm, and they kept their fire going, but the thick stone walls held the heat like a warm embrace. The wind, which howled outside like a pack of wolves, was reduced to a soft murmur inside. The snow piled high against the outside walls, but instead of making the house colder, it added another layer of insulation, like a giant soft blanket. The Miller children, young Finn and little Lily, played quietly by the hearth, drawing pictures on slates. They didn't feel the biting cold that gripped the world outside. Their parents, Martha and Thomas, felt a deep sense of relief and gratitude. They knew their ancestors had built this home with such care, not just for shelter, but for true protection, for survival. They had enough stored firewood, but they didn't need to burn it constantly because the house itself was doing so much of the work. They could cook warm meals, tell stories by the firelight, and sleep soundly, knowing the thick walls were keeping them safe. This wasn't just comfort, it was peace of mind. It meant the children would wake up healthy, ready for another day, even if that day meant staying indoors because of the snow. This experience, repeated in countless families and over countless winters, taught people a profound lesson. The old houses were not just enduring, they were life-sustaining. They were built with an understanding of what truly mattered when life was hard and nature was unforgiving. The materials, the stone, the earth, the heavy timber, were chosen not for how quickly they could be put together, but for how well they could protect and preserve life. For generations, these primitive homes had stood as silent guardians. They had seen families grow, children born, and elders pass on, all within their warm, secure embrace. They had witnessed the passing of seasons, the coming of new ideas, and the changing of times, yet their fundamental purpose remained, to keep their inhabitants safe and warm. The wisdom wasn't just in knowing how to build with these materials, but why. It was about connecting with the land, understanding its rhythms, and using its gifts to create not just shelter, but a sanctuary. These old houses weren't just structures. They were monuments to survival, built with the deep knowledge that warmth was precious, and a truly good home was one that could keep that warmth close, no matter what the outside world threw at it. They were a testament to the enduring power of simplicity and nature in the face of harsh challenges. The stories of the old houses, their quiet strength, and their unwavering warmth, spread beyond Oak Haven. They became more than just tales. They became a profound lesson for everyone. The big secret that people had slowly uncovered through storms and freezing winters was this: sometimes the oldest ways are truly the smartest ways, especially when we need to be strong against the awesome power of nature. It wasn't a lesson against new ideas or clever machines. No, the world would always find new ways to do things, and many of them were good. But it was a reminder that wisdom often comes from long experience, from watching and learning from the world around us. The ancestors who first built with thick stone and packed earth weren't primitive in a bad way. They were incredibly smart. They understood the land, the weather, and what it took to keep their families safe and alive. Imagine a young builder, perhaps Alara's grandson, much later in time. He might have studied all the new ways of building, with shiny tools and quick methods. But he would also have grown up hearing stories of the Great Storm or the long winter, and how the old houses stood firm while the newer ones struggled. He would have seen with his own eyes the ancient stone walls of Nana May's house, still standing, still offering shelter. This young builder, let's call him Leo, would start to think differently. He wouldn't just think about how fast he could build a house. He would think about how long it would last. He would think about how warm it would keep a family when the snow piled high. He would think about using materials that were kind to the earth and strong against the wind. Leo might look at the big, rough stones in the river and see not just heavy rocks, but building blocks full of history and strength. He might look at the rich earth in the fields and see not just dirt, but a material that could hug warmth close and stand firm for centuries. He might learn to combine the old wisdom with new knowledge, making houses that were both strong like the ancient ones and comfortable in new ways too. The story of these houses teaches us that true strength isn't always loud or flashy. It's often quiet, steady, and deep. It's found in the simple, heavy materials that nature provides. It's found in the wisdom of building in a way that respects the land and prepares for its challenges. Think about a towering tree. It doesn't grow fast like a weed. It grows slowly, putting down deep roots, making its trunk thick and strong over many years. When a big wind comes, the weed might snap, but the tree stands firm. The old houses were like those wise, old trees. They were built with care, often taking longer, but they were built to last, to stand strong against anything. This idea of learning from the past, from what really works, is important not just for houses, but for many things in life. Sometimes we get so excited about new inventions and quick fixes that we forget the simple, proven ways. But when things get tough, when nature shows its power, we remember what truly matters: resilience, strength, and the ability to endure. The stone, earth, hay, and raw timber, once dismissed as lowly, had proven themselves to be champions. They were honest materials that did their job faithfully, protecting lives and providing comfort without fuss or fanfare. Their story is a reminder that we should always look back and learn, even as we look forward and innovate. The past holds lessons that can help us build a better, stronger future, one where our homes are not just shelters, but true guardians, standing tall against time and nature, just as they did for generations before us. The oldest ways, in their quiet wisdom, often hold the keys to our greatest strengths.